I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm, where I respond to some of Russell Brand's interviews. Today, I'm responding to number 211, Fighting Corruption Using a Spiritual Perspective with Sarah Chayes. Now, I've realized that of my 38 beloved subscribers, most are not actually coming from having watched Russell Brand. So I'm going to provide some context so that you don't feel like this has no relevance. Really, I use these ideas as a springboard and launch into my own ideas. So don't worry if you don't have the background of having heard these interviews. In this, Sarah was recommended by Sebastian Junger, a previous interview of Russell's, and I have another episode on that called Interdependence versus Interbeing. And I recorded that one on Halloween wearing my cheetah spots, so it's pretty fun. And she also talks about Ian McGilchrist. So I recently re-released one of my episodes called What is the Matter? On Ian McGilchrist, because I'm bumping up some of the sound quality and adding some end screens and deciding to just be fearless about the fact that those actually had a few views, which is a lot for me, and to just say, I can redo this and it's okay. They will come back if it's meant to be. So I want to look at the perspective of the crisis as a micro festival. And Charles Eisenstein, another person that Russell has interviewed, has a recent article on Substack where he says that the festival is a time when all the rules are suspended. Something like Burning Man is a great example. And that we had these times when people could act in different ways because there were no rules. And he says the joke is the last remaining vestige of the micro festival, because in the joke you can get away with things because the rules are suspended. And I think that's really important for why Russell is such a strong voice of speaking the truth, is because he's making it funny, and it's hard to be sanctimonious about criticizing someone when they're doing something in a way that is both funny and also embracing of other people. So I think that the crisis is also a time that allows us to be our true selves, because it takes away the rules that keep us trapped in these roles that don't suit us. And I think that this is very good news, because it means that we don't have to change human nature in order to save the world, because our nature isn't greedy. Our nature is egalitarian, and what we need isn't to take a hard look at ourselves and change who we are. What we need is just permission to do the thing that our heart wants to do anyway. And so we don't need that crisis. What we need is a system that enables that and makes it possible. So in the intro to this, in Russell's intros, what he does is called the banter decanter with his producer, Jenny May Finn, and they have this rapport that is a very teasing one, especially on Russell's part. Now, I think this is really smart, because my social media advisor is my daughter, Cassandra, and she says the most important thing is that you can never be mean, even if it's to someone who everyone agrees deserves it because they're arrogant, because they're pompous. You can't ever be mean, because if you do, it will be catching. Your readers, your viewers will start being mean, and then they'll start being mean to each other, and then they'll start being mean to you. And so you have to make sure that you don't let that ever seep into your podcast. And I think that for me, the most difficult thing to resist is mean funny. when you think of that thing, and it's just so funny, but it's mean. If I have that difficulty, imagine how hard that is for Russell. So, what he does is, I think, with Jenny May Finn, since they have a long relationship and great affection, clearly, is that he uses her as his snark spittoon. He just clears his throat of all the mean funny so that then he can move on to his interviews without any of that temptation. And she just flicks it off her back like, a white duck. And so I think that's a really great way that makes this more human, and also is able to keep that separate where there is clearly such great rapport. So in the banter decanter, Russell's talking about his kids and his life, and what he says is that when work ends, reality begins for him, and that's what he wishes for Jen. And Jen says, I don't even think that I want kids. No one should have kids if they don't want them, and I don't think that I really want them. And that's perfectly valid. But what I want to look at is, do young people have a choice? Is the choice of having kids something that has been made so inaccessible and such a sacrifice that instead we're captured in having our lives be about working? And so Jen mentioned something about, that she isn't sure that even if she did, that they'd be there taking care of her on her deathbed. And I don't know whether being on your deathbed and saying, well, I spent my life and I made YouTube's investors a little bit richer. That's not the life I want for anyone. What I want is for someone to say, here's the things that I was able to do for my community and for the next generation. And whether I had kids or not, I was part of this. I produced this beautiful thing that has come out of our society. And I am part of this family, this bigger family than just this nuclear family. And so I want to make that something that's possible for everyone. That's what I wish also for Jen, because what you have and what Russell recognizes with having that choice is something that everyone should have the choice of. So there's a point at which Sarah talks about how we have not just white supremacy, but Homo sapiens supremacy, that we see ourselves as having this superior right to exist on the earth. And that overpopulation is really a problem, and that we don't need, that bigger is not necessarily better. I think we should be questioning any time that we agree with Bill Gates, because as Sarah says, we're not resisting the manipulation. And part of that manipulation, I think, is this concept that overpopulation is a problem and it's selfish to have kids and it's indulgent and you are just using up more than your fair share of the resources by taking responsibility for giving the same thing that has been given to you. So in my episode, Parenting as Anarchy, I really explore that as something that I think parents are not getting support, and they're not getting moral support for how hard what they're doing is, because it's been made into this idea of being something that is just selfish. There is also, I just have to say, I love it that there is a woman who's being interviewed, and it's a woman who's telling the real story of anarchy and what anarchy was in truth, which is community self-governance, and also talking about the farmer movements, the revolt of the farmers, and how intelligent and beautiful their self-governance was, and what they were asking for from the government. I talk a lot about that in my book when I talk about the populist movement and how that has created, it had created what became the solution to the Great Depression, even though it didn't follow what they wanted. So Sarah says, well, in order to have what we have today, it took 2 world wars and a Great Depression and a pandemic that was worse than what we have now. I don't think that's actually what it took. I think the advances were made by the people who were demanding it, and that these things were all impediments and distractions and ways that furthered the purposes of the empire at the expense of what it is that the people wanted. So that role of crisis, I think, is something that Sarah talks about, that is such a wonderful thing, where she talks about how it brings out the egalitarian in all of us. And that Russell talks about how personal trauma also has that effect. That it reminded me of that Leonard Cohen line, that the crack is where the light gets in. So that's been part of the transformational experience, and that people need to go through that dark night of the soul in order to be able to come to that place where they can be vulnerable, and that our vulnerability is strength. I think that the personal crisis has the same role as the social crisis. It's a time when you have to say, okay, well, I can't do it anymore. I can't play this role anymore. I can't go out in the business world and make the rich richer. I have to, because of this brokenness, I have to retreat. I have to take care of myself, because I just can't cope with what's being asked of me anymore. That is something that individually, I think, has brought people to a really beautiful place of being able to recognize what's important. But I don't think it has to be that way. I think that we can make that same transformation possible for everyone, because we're all existing in this broken place. We all are faking it. And there's a part of us that knows we're faking it. And if we're able to fake it well enough to get by, good for us. But that doesn't mean that I think it's not necessarily something that will be an incentive for other people to say, you have to go through this dark night of the soul. I would like to have people look at us and say, ooh, I want what she's having, because whatever it is making her really happy. And so being a model of the kind of life that we could have. Now, Sarah mentions that, that she is able to have that. She says comfort isn't really the point, and that she often lives in a cabin where she needs to fetch her own water. There's a way in which that life is actually a luxury, because in order to have the time to fetch your own water, you need a certain amount of security. The thing we've most been deprived of is our own time and our own creativity. And instead, we're being barraged with this series of stimulations and distractions. But it doesn't change that hunger. A recent episode of mine has been from FOMO to JOMO, from the fear of missing out to the joy of missing out. And so her desire to simplify her life, I think, is a beautiful thing. And I think other people want that more than we're giving them maybe credit for. That the people who she mentions as not taking, as being soft enablers, people who don't necessarily want to change the system, and people who are not taking that hard look in the mirror to say, how am I part of this problem? I don't think we need to convert those people in the first wave. That the first wave, we could just take all of us who are saying, I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't need these kinds of latest gadgets. What I want is the ability to give the best of myself to my community, to my family, to my neighborhood, and to the world, and have a way to be able to do that. If we can be soft enablers of the system that we want, other people will follow or not, but it gives us a choice. And so that's what I'd like to see when she mentions the GDP and the idea of quality over quantity. I think that's a really important thing to look at. Also in my book, I quote Robert F. Kennedy, Sr., and his address at a graduation, and saying the GDP does not measure the love of our families. It doesn't measure the quality of our life and how loving our relationships are. And so, yes, we need to really be focusing on that as our measure of success. And I hope for Jen and for my daughter's generation and all of that generation in the world, that we can be soft enablers of the life that we want for them, so that they have a choice of saying, should my labor serve what I love in the community, or should I go and, live this selfish life with lots of arcades and gadgets? Until we have that choice, I don't think we can blame anyone for choosing to make themselves comfortable while they're in the midst of doing something very hard that is sacrificing all the things that could truly make them happy. Thank you. And if you enjoyed that, here is one of the videos that I mentioned, and here is a playlist that goes along the same lines. And if you would be another of my subscribers, that would make me so happy. Thank you.